All right. Hello, everybody. So, yet again, we have another long lecture because these first few weeks we need to get quite a lot of information out. So, yet again, I recommend on occasion maybe coming back to these, rewatching them, and trying to get a bit of a sense for all of this stuff because these 2 weeks really are all of the fundamental information that you need for the rest of the course. And pretty much from next week on, we're going to be talking about additional topics to support everything that we've covered in these few weeks, but it's probably a good idea to refresh on these 2 weeks in particular because they cover a lot of grounds in a very small amount of time. So if you were going to go back and review anything, I highly recommend it be these 2 weeks of lectures. So just be aware of that. There is a ton of content in here, but over time we're going to be reducing the amounts that we talk about in each lecture. So just take some time to digest this stuff. All of the things that we're talking about in these 2 weeks are going to pop up recurringly over the course because they are that fundamental. So make sure you take some time early to digest all of this content. Go over the slides on your own time, review the videos again, whatever you need to digest it. And absolutely ask questions in chat, ask questions on Discord. I'm happy to clarify this stuff. So let's get started. I want to recap what we talked about last week because it was quite a lot. So I want to make sure that that's fresh in everybody's head and highlight what the major topics were. So we talked about what games are. We talked about it from a definition standpoint, and we talked about it from a structural standpoint. So the very first thing that we saw was just how much every little aspect of game design or everything that you put into a game affects the overall player experience in some way. And really, as game designers, that's one of the key insights that we need to take away, that the small decisions that we make can have massive ramifications for player experience, and we need to be aware of when we are actually making those decisions, because those tend to be things that we maybe put into the background and forget about, but they really do affect the player experience, like the Doom health bar versus, say, generic World War X health bar. That's the role of a game designer. Maybe the first building block of making a game is understanding what the game designer is supposed to do. And when we see that, the role of the game designer really is to advocate to the player, or advocate for the player, to be the stand-in for the player in the team and make sure the player is getting the best experience. That means asking questions, providing answers, evaluating those answers, and then asking new questions based off of, well, what the player actually liked and disliked. It's trying to push things to be the absolute very best for the gameplay experience. And that does mean not getting caught up on the things that you think are fun that ultimately don't lead to a lot of fun for the player. And that is the iterative design process. We want to make something so that we can play it. We examine why it was boring from a player perspective. We fix that thing and then we play it again, or we give it to a player to play so that we have a more accurate representation of what the player is experiencing. We tried to talk about definitions a little bit. I did say that the specific definitions aren't necessarily important, but it is useful to see when we look at all of these different academic definitions, what is common across all of them. And we see a lot of these different rules pop up, which kind of come down to it's a problem-solving activity approached with a playful attitude. And I do really like Schell's definition here. I think it pulls a lot of these things together. But more importantly, it highlights that game development, game design, it's about problem solving. It's about doing it in a fun, willful way. You're entering it into it freely, and there's no external ramifications for doing things. You can be very playful about it. So that brings us to ways to actually see games beyond just a definition, but how can we actually look at a game in a way that's valuable to us as a game designer? We start getting into our different lenses, our different perspectives. So the first lens, the first perspective we looked at was the elemental tetrad, a way for us to see the harmony of all the different massive literal building blocks of the game. A game technically, literally cannot exist without these elements. So we have technology, and this is just a vague notion of our technology. We just need to look at this not in strict technical terms. There was a lot of confusion about that in the last lecture. We don't need to be very strict with these. It's just so long as it helps us to look at our game in a meaningful way. So we have the technology. A VR game is going to perform differently from a phone game. A phone game is going to play differently from a tabletop game. A console game is going to play differently than a desktop PC game. They're all going to have different ways of affecting the player experience. We don't need to consider it so specifically. We don't need to say the difference between this keyboard and that keyboard, that processor and that processor. That's not the purpose of this. It's just so that we know how is it going to meaningfully impact the player experience. We have the mechanics, which is a very broad term in this case. It's pretty much anything that you intentionally put into the game as a rule. If you actually go into the textbook on the section on mechanics, there is a lot of different definitions of mechanics that we might be able to get into a little bit later, but effectively think about it as the stuff that the designer is intentionally putting in. We have the story, and that can be the literal story, or it can be the story that the player kind of tells tells to themselves, the actual happening of the game, if you will. And then we have the aesthetic, which in this case means the actual audiovisual aesthetic. What's the theme of it, and how does that contribute to the overall harmony of your game? We then try to look deeper into the underlying structure. So this really brings us into that mechanic zone a little bit more. And we start thinking about structurally, what are the things that we need to put into a game so that we can play it? So that was if we take a look out and see what a game is. This is looking at what a game is from a much more designer central perspective. So we have actions or procedures, which are initiated by players. We have resources that help us with making those actions more meaningful. So they're things that we apply value to. We have obstacles that get in the way of achieving goals. And we have many, many goals that build up to an overall outcome or a set of potential outcomes. And all along this way, we have all kinds of rules that we have strictly defined to allow these things to happen. And we actually start to see kind of a looping structure here. Even before we start recapping the game loop, we see that once we take our actions, we get through our obstacles, we achieve our goals, we then come back to having to take new actions and maybe make use of new resources and make our way down it again to get to our outcomes. We talked about loops, or at least if you watched the last 10 minutes of the video, which was very important, then you learned about loops. So we looked at Binding of Isaac and how it has this series of loops going from the smallest second by second loop of I just need to run, kill, and collect things, and the many questions that come with that, and how we can think about these in different levels. What skills are we training? What problems are they solving at different times? And what skills or what questions are we asking of them at each of those different levels? And actually, this is looking ahead a little bit, but I think this is an important connection that you should be making here. This is from Dan Cook's blog, The Lost Garden, but it's also posted to Gamasutra. Basically, when we see this loop, we can actually atomize it. We can think of it as one ingredient in our game, where let's say we have jump in a platformer. Jump, we need to press a button, and then the rules of it are going to be jumping and colliding, and then we get some visual feedback by it animating on screen, and then our mental model updates to say, oh, I can jump in this, okay. So if they successfully made it through that loop, their mental model now tells them that they can jump and everything is working fine. But then once we can do this, we can start expanding this. We can start saying, okay, so we've trained them on this skill. So now this skill requires this one. We have prerequisites. This is actually how we design courses throughout our kind of curriculum discussions. We think about what skills you need, what skills is a course going to teach you, and then that's how we design our prerequisites. We look at the output skills of a course and we see what input skills we need for a course. And we have a big branching kind of structure like that. So much in the same way as we design course curriculums with prerequisites, we can think of every skill that we train in a game, each loop that we're working on, as, well, a bunch of other prerequisite knowledge going into it. What things do they need to know in their mental model to actually complete this loop properly? And we see, again, from this blog post, you can actually see a blown up version of it in the blog post. Tetris, for example, this is what it looks like in Tetris. These are the skills that you are building up in Tetris so that you can actually see the current state or the predicted state of the player's mental model through the progression of your game. And this is an outstanding way to just prototype your games. If you can learn to build these skill diagrams, these skill chain diagrams, then you can actually really start thinking about the progression of your game from a very, very early level and what you want them to be experiencing at any given point. So I would highly recommend, even though we are going to briefly talk about this after reading a week, I highly recommend taking a look at this post if you are interested in learning how these kinds of problem-solving chains build up. So one thing that I want to do really quickly, just to recap this loops and this idea of kind of using loops as skill chains, is how Nintendo makes use of these. They're famous for their approach in using these loops very explicitly to train skills and to make the player feel awesome. So let's take a quick look at this, and you can see how Nintendo makes use of it, of these things. So that tells us that we can safely teach a new mechanic. We get rid of that safety net, and then we put a twist on it. That adds this kind of extra flavor to it, something exciting. And then it gives us a point not to try out a new skill, um, not to learn something, but instead to demonstrate how awesome that skill that we learned is. We get some kind of rush of excitement for showcasing our new abilities. And that's important. I want you to hold on to that throughout this whole lecture, that sense of, wow, we did something really cool there. So all this week, we're going to be talking about why we play games. Last week, it was all about the building blocks, and now we're going to be talking about why exactly we get into games in the first place, and what maybe starts to lead to feeling like one game is better than another. Which I do also want to stay away from black and white language like that, this whole term. And I want to invite you to avoid black and white language. I don't like saying that a game is necessarily good or bad. I don't like saying a particular thing is good and bad, because all of them are contextually dependent. What works in one game might not work in another game for many, many reasons. It's very complex. So I want to try and have this whole class avoid having this concept of something is innately good or innately bad. It's entirely context driven, so don't get caught up on that. So let's start this discussion on why we play by talking about meaningful play. What does it mean to be meaningful? And the questions that we're going to try and answer today are: why do we play games? What feelings do we get that are kind of unique to the medium of games? We might feel them in other places, but when it comes to actually experiencing them in kind of a media setting, it tends to be in games. And how does the player actually experience games? How do we as a designer understand the experience of game playing at a bit of a different level? Now, I'm going to spoil it for you. This is what you should be paying attention to. So the feelings unique to a play, well, we have flow and fiero. We're going to talk about those first. At the end of the lecture, we're going to talk about the overall experience. So how does a designer make a gameplay experience? How do we design a gameplay experience? Well, we start with gameplay mechanics. We see how that builds up dynamics, and then that brings us over to gameplay aesthetics, which we'll be talking about more in next lecture. And then we're going to look at why we play games, which again is the aesthetics, but there's also a lot on kind of fulfillment and meaningful choice that we'll be talking about more of. And then on Thursday, we're going to be talking about the kind of proper motivations of play, different types of players, and why different players play different types of games. So many things can make a game feel meaningful or impactful. And in chat, I want you to try and, while I'm talking, talk about some feelings that you get in games. Really think about that feeling that you get in games that you don't really get in other media, like movies, books, or music. And there might be some overlap, of course, but what are some feelings that you get in games that you don't see in other places? Now, one that I'm going to put out there, this is a very common and very popular one that when we're talking about games, is flow. And this is something that we see in so many places. But I do want to clarify real quick. I'm not talking about game flow. Game flow is incredibly valuable to know, and actually right at the start, we aren't going to talk about this formally, but this is actually a very useful tool for your toolkit when you're designing games, is basically a flowchart that describes the order of interactions for a game. And you've probably done flowcharts for programming before, but I highly recommend considering maybe making a flowchart when you're trying to design out the gameplay, because it helps you realize, oh, have we accounted for all different situations in our gameplay? So it's really useful to describe your flowchart. It's a really nice prototyping tool before you sit down to program anything, to make sure your flow is all there, that you've actually accounted for all of these different things. And I just wanted to put up here is like a detailed flow diagram for a game that I worked on recently, a card game. This is just the attack phase, but one of the advantages of doing it this way was that it was very detailed. I had the exact ordering of each thing that needed to apply, and then when I was actually going to program it afterwards, with our full team, we all had this as a reference document, so we easily knew what order things had to go in. And actually, I ended up trading this off to the programmer who hadn't thought much about the flow of the turns, whereas I was thinking about the rules and systems interactions of the turns. And because this was detailed enough of a flow diagram, they were able to just take it and get it implemented right away. So very useful to have your flow diagrams and make a habit of building flow diagrams. But that isn't the flow we're talking about today. That is game flow. Today we're talking about flow states. So let's just set a scene for what a flow state is. Let's say you're playing an instrument and you've lost track of time and you start just feeling one with the music and everything else fades away. Let's say you start coding on a new project and you're super excited. You know exactly what you want to write. Every function just starts to write itself and you barely have to think about the problem that you're solving. It just seems like you have a series of solutions, and before you realize it, you have an awesome project. Maybe you've been playing a platformer for some number of hours at this point, and you barely recognize that you're actually playing the game anymore. It's just happening. You are still encountering issues, but it seems like you have the solution to overcome them. You're rapidly getting through these problems. It starts to feel like a meditation. It isn't too difficult. It isn't too boring. You know what to do and how to do it. You're exerting your effort where it needs to be exerted. The flow of the actions, well, it seems inevitable that you would go from A to B to C. There's no crazy internal conflict for where you should be going, or at least if there is, it still feels good to progress through those. Most commonly, this is described as feeling in the zone. And this is what we mean when you've entered a flow state. Now, this was originally proposed. I'm not going to attempt to say the name, unfortunately, but it's on screen. This was originally proposed as a way of describing productivity. And it's the result of effectively boredom and anxiety. We start to ignore other concerns. We lose track of time and we start engaging in a task just because it's worth engaging in. We like engaging in it. And it's a big theory, full book on it if you want to read it. It's actually a really nice book. It can teach you a lot about kind of work habits and getting motivated for stuff. But when we talk about it in games, we typically look at it more like this. How difficult is the task at hand? And what is the skill of the player engaging in that task? And as we've been learning, at the start we were talking about skill atoms, and last time we were talking about breaking the game loop and how that can change the player experience. Well, we have the same thing here. So the level of difficulty is how many skills they're using. It's how trained they are on the skill. So how bored or anxious the player is at any given time is unique to the player, but we can start to get general ideas. Now, if they're a great player, they're awesome, they know exactly what to do, they're highly skilled, but the tasks they're completing are kind of easy, that they hang out in this boredom zone where, okay, why am I even bothering to do this? Now, when we're talking about weak players encountering difficult tasks, then they'll find it frustrating. They won't be able to progress. Maybe they don't even know what they're doing wrong. Ideally, we want to keep the player oscillating back and forth between something just a little bit straining that pushes them to kind of improve and learn from something, but not so straining that it starts making them anxious and feeling rough. We also want to give them some reprieve. We want some periods where they can relax a little bit, just have a little bit of an easier time without sending them all the way to boredom. Maybe that's just how long we let them cozy up, or maybe it's how deeply we force them to cozy up. And games do this all the time. We're going to talk about this later when we're talking about pacing level design. The goal of it is to make them feel competent. More or less, that's what we're looking for. So consider this. Have you ever been in a flow state before? Let us know in chat if you want to, if you've ever been in a flow state, and maybe what are some of the things that snapped you out of that flow state? Include that with that, because I think that's important for us to recognize as designers. So the next emotion we're going to talk about is fiero, which really is fulfilling a human need in us. Let's think about a few cases here. you've just placed the final block on a month-long Minecraft build. Final block, and you zoom out and you see this massive build, and you're just, oh, fantastic. You've successfully clutched a 1v5 situation in a tournament. I've certainly felt this before, playing in a professional FPS tournament, and your entire team is gone. You're the only one left, and somehow you prevented the other team from capturing the objective, and you ended up winning the match. Whew, what a feeling. You managed to reach 10 hearts with that elusive villager that you could barely ever find, but you finally reached 10 hearts with them. Oh, it feels so good. And this little thing comes up at some point. 100% completion. It's pretty good. Fiero is what we feel after we triumph over adversity. You know it when you feel it and when you see it. That's because we almost all express fiero in exactly the same way. We throw our hands over our head and yell. So if you want to learn a little bit more about fiero and really the fulfillment that games can provide us, I highly recommend this book, Reality is Broken by Jane McGonigal. She describes how games really provide us with fulfillments that we're craving in everyday life, but we rarely achieve. So one of the ways that we can look at games, according to Jane, is that games are an opportunity for us to focus our energy with relentless optimism at something that we're good at, or at least something that we're getting better at, and that we enjoy. Gameplay is the direct emotional opposite of depression. It's an enemy of it. And this is an important way to see games as something that we're really trying to seek meaning in. We're really trying to engage in something that we like, that makes us happy, that we're good at doing. Games that are difficult tend to be difficult because they want you to feel a sense of fiero. They want you to feel this sense of achievement. And when we make games that are difficult, that don't provide you with that sense of achievement, then we've probably done something wrong. So this is one good way to look at games, something that's going to help us find meaning. But what exactly goes into making an experience feel meaningful? Well, for the next while, we're going to be talking about choice, meaningful choice, and how we as people are motivated in and outside of games. Now, I want everyone to take just a brief moment and reflect on this next slide. I don't want you to post it in chat. I want this to be a personal consideration. I want you to really think about this because this should set the tone for what we're talking about. I want you to contrast what you think about on this next slide with some of the other experiences that you've seen in games. If games are problem solving, if games are about learning, then why isn't school always fun? This was asked in chat, and it almost always comes up when we talk about game design, because why isn't it always fun? Again, keep it to yourself. I really want you to ponder these ideas. And why isn't work always fulfilling? If work is really about solving problems, if we're trying to always boost our skills at work and learn new things, if school isn't always fun, then why aren't they fulfilling? Why aren't they fun? And actually, Reality is Broken goes into this as well. It talks about how we can try to find a little bit more fun and fulfillment in these places by thinking about games. So if you're interested, excellent book. Definitely worth the read. Now, Sid Meier said, or at least has been paraphrased, that games are a series of interesting decisions. And this tells us quite a bit about our perspectives on the game loop, on this idea of skill atoms, that throughout an entire game, really what we're doing moment to moment is making tiny, tiny little decisions. And ideally, they're interesting ones, the ones that make us feel interested, that satisfy our curiosity. So what exactly is a choice? We need to get some definitions out here so that we can talk consistently about this. Well, a lot of people immediately jump to narrative choice, for example. We might say, looking at a Telltale game, we might say, okay, well, we have 4 options, we select one, and the narrative changes. And that's absolutely a type of choice. We might think about other choices as well. We might think about choosing a player and that player is going to affect our gameplay. We might think about which path do I walk down when I'm going down a path. But there is so many more types of choice available to us in games, but they all have these common attributes. We have more than one available course of action. We have 2, 3, 4, 100, some infinite continuous amount of decisions. But at the end of the day, we can only take fewer actions than the number available. Maybe we can choose 3 out of 4, and that's still making a choice because we didn't choose one. But at the end of the day, a choice is just we have many things that we can do, and we can only take fewer than all of them. Or I guess we could arrange that and think about the order that we take the choices in, but that's more complicated than we need to consider right now. Another aspect of choice is that we can be implicitly making a choice or explicitly making a choice. Or maybe we can also think about it as we're being implicitly or explicitly presented a choice. So has the game shown us a list of options, and we pick from that list of options, maybe through a clear menu, maybe through a dialogue prompt? Or does the game just present us with stuff and we interact with that stuff in a way that we choose? Now, there was a great video posted just yesterday at the time of recording that goes into some of these examples of invisible choices and the ways that having hidden implicit choices help us. And I'm really thankful for it because there's a lot of great examples in there that will really help this. So if you're interested in seeing a little bit more about these hidden choices, then absolutely check out this video. Now, when we talk about implicit versus explicit choice, it usually parallels the discussion on head versus hands. Not always, but it tends to parallel head versus hands. When we're making a decision based on our head, then we're being deliberate. We're thinking about puzzle solving or explicit mental problem solving. We're coming up with an answer to a question purely based off of deliberation. Whereas if the result of a choice, and we're branching choice out to mean anything where we could do a bunch of stuff, but we're doing fewer than all of them, then we can also do it in a skillful way by pressing buttons really fast or by rapidly using your muscle memory to perform a set of actions, maybe without you even thinking about it. Then that's probably using your hands. And you need to learn how to combine and balance these based off of the type of game that you're making. Is your game more heady? Is it more handsy? And which one is it going to, does this choice actually lean on? Once you can start to do that, it will help you flow your game a little better as you can start to balance which moments need that more thoughtful deliberation, which moments need that more action-driven stuff. And maybe your game is exclusively one or the other, and that's perfectly fine. Do recognize that it's not a clear-cut distinction. Sometimes a choice will have a nice combination of both of these. You may need to deliberate on the tactic that you want to approach something with, but you still need to have skillful action to actually get the result that you desire. So it can exist somewhere on a spectrum here. Now, along with these types of choices, we also have false choices, and these aren't always bad. They might sound bad up front, but they actually help us a lot as a game designer. And in fact, if they're done right, they're probably one of the best things we can provide. Basically, we think about one or more actions, and we need to take fewer than that. But I never included disequal outcomes there. Sure, you're choosing from fewer options than you have, but who's to say that choosing the other options actually led to any difference in the game whatsoever, or at least any big, impactful change whatsoever? Now, frequently we see these in role-playing games. We see small actions that we can take between our disequal options, and it'll lead to some tiny amount of diverged gameplay, maybe a small audio line changed, or something, some kind of a new, I don't know, a new armor color for a character, and it feels really impactful for some reason. But as we're going to learn more in our narrative lectures, we can take advantage of this in some very interesting ways to make the player feel like they made an impactful decision when they really didn't. All the player needs is to feel like they had an effect on the gameplay. We're nudging them around within this narrow linear space, but as long as we nudge them correctly and we provide them with the right feedback, then they'll feel pretty good about it. So the example that one of the examples we'll talk about in the narrative structure is how a lot of the Mass Effect games actually use the exact same voice line regardless of what decision you make, but that voice line was tailored very specifically to work for any of those, so it flows well. Now, a really easy trap for designers to make, especially when you're first getting started and you're thinking about how can I improve my game, is to just start introducing more and more choices. And there's a lot of problem with this. So too many choices introduces what's called choice paralysis. If you've ever gone to a grocery store and looked at the massive wall of soups or anything like that, and you just ended up walking out without that soup, it's because you had choice paralysis. There was so many options in front of you that the easiest option for you to make was to not decide at all. So we need to be careful of how many options we're providing the player. We need to be careful to not provide too few choices, because when we provide no choice at all, we're basically making a movie. So we want to introduce choice because that's one of the differentiating factors of games. We want to be mindful that sometimes introducing a choice for one part of the game can take away a choice for the other. And I think the way that this comes up is through dominant choice, or when one choice is clearly superior over the other ones. So this is referred to as dominant strategy. This is when we presented a choice to the player, but one of them is clearly superior to the other. This might be a little bit too obvious, but if we could give the player a sword that deals 10 times as much damage as this other sword, and there is absolutely nothing different between the two, they're clearly going to take the one that does 10 times the damage. There's really no reason for them not to, at least if we're assuming a regular player. So there wasn't really a choice there. We kind of accidentally disillusioned ourselves as a designer that there was a false choice, that we presented them with options, but there really wasn't any outcome. And the player can see that there isn't any outcome that would benefit from taking the worst option. So we want to be careful with introducing dominant strategies. And actually, we do it quite often as the result of playtests. We have an experience in mind, so we test our game, and we think, oh, they aren't doing that thing I wanted to. Maybe we should encourage them a little bit more. So they aren't making the choice that you expected, so you make that choice a little bit nicer, and then you make it a little nicer and a little nicer and a little nicer, and then people start taking that action. In fact, they start taking that action all the time. In fact, they stop taking the other action, but because you wanted them to take that action more often, you might have missed the fact that now it's become dominant and they aren't trying anything else. So be very careful when you're playtesting not to just completely cater to the experience you want them to have. Leave room for choice. Don't let it be dominant. A small aside is that not all games have choice, or maybe things that we've called games don't have choice. Take the game War, for example. You have a deck of cards that you split into two, and then each player flips a card at the same time. Whoever has the highest card takes both of them and adds it to their score. And then you flip another card. Whoever has the highest takes it, puts it on the side. Is this a game? And I think there's an incredibly strong argument that no, it's not a game, because we don't have choice, we don't have any skills being practiced, we don't have any of that. But why do we have it? And we'll find, if you look around at a lot of games, that children's games tend not to have skillful action. They tend not to make any meaningful impact on the game state because we don't want them to feel bad for doing something wrong. Really, what we're trying to train there in them is social interaction, is following the rules of something, to understand the social contract that we're creating when we go into a game. So there's other skills that are being trained there if you don't even have that foundation of a mental model coming into it. So maybe it is a game to some people, to people who have such a minimal mental model that they can't actually engage in bigger games. So they are going through their own game loop. But it might be safest to, at least for this course, say maybe it's not a game, it's a toy. Maybe. Open question. There's very few firm answers in this course. So that brings us to the topic of meaningful choice, or why schools aren't always fulfilling, or why work isn't always fulfilling. Remember that thing that I want you to think about earlier. Why isn't work always fun? Why isn't school always fun? Well, we could consider a meaningful choice any choice where a player feels like they had an effect when they made that choice. We could consider an illusion choice to be meaningful if they still felt like it had purpose, if they accomplished something from their choice. Now, really, when we're giving the player choices, it's because we want them to be motivated. We want them to be making a decision and feel something good. Ideally, they're getting a sense of fiero out of it, that the choices are contributing to a sense of flow. We want them to feel the accomplishment for learning those new skills. We want them to feel like they built up something new and that they now have new competencies going forward so they can take on bigger and badder tasks going forward. This brings us to the important discussion on motivation. And traditionally, we've always talked about extrinsic motivation. This is actually really for the world, I think, and this is a stretch of a definition. I do want to put this out there. This is quite a stretch, but there's a few important topics here. For a long time in society, we have focused on extrinsic motivation. This is, in a nutshell, offering a reward for performing actions that you do. And by offering that award, you're more likely to want to perform that action after. And you're going to want to perform it over and over again to get more rewards. And on the converse of that, when we penalize you for an action, then you're less likely to perform that action. Now, a Skinner box is, this was a very famous experiment in operant conditioning where the scientist B.F. Skinner put rats in a little box that when the red light would shine, they would shock the floor so that the rat would receive a small shock. And when the green light would press, then when the green light would go, if they push a lever, then they would get some food. I described that pretty poorly, but basically, if the red light is on and they press a lever, they get shocked. If a green light is on and they press a lever, they get food. So they get penalized if they take one action. They get rewarded if they take another action. And the rats definitely pick up on it pretty quickly. They pick up on it fast that they don't want to be shocked, and they do want food, so I guess they need to take these actions. But notice that throughout this, I haven't said that they want to perform the action. They don't want to press the lever. They don't want to take action. Instead, they want the reward. They don't want the penalty. But that's very different from wanting to press a lever. Whereas in a game, we're very interested in making the players actually want to press the levers. We don't want them to want so extensively to the things that they'll get at the end of the game. Now, I do want to put this out there. This isn't an entirely bad thing. A lot of people, when they talk about Skinner boxes, tend to talk about them as, oh, we're Skinner boxing the players again. But Skinner boxes are an excellent way of reinforcing the mental model, as long as we use our duty of care as a game designer not to abuse this. This would be a great time for us to dig into a discussion on loot boxes and daily rewards and all of this stuff. And maybe we can have some chat about that at some point. But really, you can see these Skinner box reward systems in a lot of places in games, in the greater society, where if I give you more money, if I give you higher grades, then you're more likely to want to do something. If I penalize you, you're less likely to want to do something. And again, if we see that as a way to reinforce the mental model, to say, you see this thing in a way that now you understand what's good and now you understand what's bad, then That helps us to learn the world, that provides us with context for our actions, but it doesn't make us want to do the actions. An important distinction there. It teaches us which actions are good and which actions are bad, but it doesn't make us want to do the action. So, if our game is exclusively a Skinner box, then it might lack fulfillment. We don't want to be doing the actions we're doing. We just want the rewards that the actions give us. So we need to find a way to make the players want to do the actions, not just get the rewards for them. And this is where self-determination theory comes in, or intrinsic motivation. And this is now the dominant theory in psychology on why we as people get motivated to do anything, why we want to actually take the actions that we take. And it turns out it's not really based on reward structures. So we can see this as car with the kind of addition S that I've seen in some other places. We won't talk much about that one, but I'll briefly mention it. Now, the three major pillars of intrinsic motivation are competence, autonomy, and relationships. We'll dig into each of those in just a moment. But especially when we're talking about games, I tend to see this fourth one pop up, which is sensation. So intrinsic motivation theory is all about the things that make us want to do stuff for the sake of doing them. I think it's pretty fair for us to say that if something gives us a really cool particle effect, or if music sounds really nice, or something is just generally promoting that sense pleasure, then we like it and we kind of want more of it just for the sake of. So as we're talking about all of these things, do also remember that some really nice sensation can also make something enjoyable just for the sake of doing it. So what are these things? What do they mean in the greater space of everything? Well, competency is our way of saying, I'm awesome. It's about us overcoming obstacles. But more so than that, it's about actually letting us practice our skills and seeing our skills improve. It's that sense of fiero again. We need that sense of fiero. We need that sense of competency to feel good about the actions that we're taking. Like we're actually accomplishing something and that our skills are being appreciated. Then we have this feeling of autonomy, which is just another way of saying we have freedom. We can make our own choices. We can act without huge fear of consequence. Just we know that we're free to act and we can tinker around a little bit without everything crashing and burning. It means that we can make something our own, that we can put a little bit of ourselves out into the world in the work that we're doing and the problems that we're solving. This is all about the freedom to enter, the freedom to exit, and the ability to explore and customize with minimal consequence. And then finally, we have relationships. We, as mammals, want to be connected to other people. We specifically, as mammals, have developed the ability to de-stress by being in close contact with other people, or with other mammals, really. I mean, we have pets over here, and petting pets can actually make you de-stress. Hugging people can make you de-stress. All of these things are innate to humanity, innate to mammalian nature. We want to be a part of a community. We want to see ourselves in a community, and we want to kind of be there for each other, and we want others to be there for us. So relationships are a huge way that we can motivate players. And indeed, games are one of the most relationship nurturing places. We don't even really need to talk about it much because connecting in a video game fandom is huge. We see video game fandoms all the time. Online gaming is huge. Tabletop gaming is huge because we get to play with other people. We get to have shared experiences with other people. And we can even simulate it by giving you relationships in games with non-human people, but we still give you that sense of triumph and that sense of being a part of something. Now, I really do see meaningful choice as being choices which can intrinsically motivate you. That the choice itself is the reward. That the ability to go through that game loop is what makes that game loop meaningful. The consequences of whatever you do, that's the feedback of your choice. That's how you know if you're doing well or if you're doing poorly. It's what lets you know how much freedom you have or how little freedom you have. This presents us with a few questions just based off of that we can consider anytime we present the player with a choice to determine, is this going to make a meaningful impact on them? Does it make them feel more competent in some way? Does it test their skills? Does it provide them with feedback on where their skills are at? Does it let them show off how awesome their skills are? Like at the end of every Mario level, you do a little showcase of like, hey, look at how cool this is, and it gives you a big sense explosion. Does it make them feel in control? Are the controls terrible and they don't feel like they're having an impact on it? Do they feel like the choice was made entirely at random and they didn't really actually get any say in what happens? Do they feel like there's more paths that they can go down, or they're being railroaded down a particular path? And then, can they use this in a relationship somehow? Can it build a new relationship, change a relationship with in-game characters or with real people? This is why we're seeing so many games start having share options. Well, it's one of the reasons we're seeing a lot of games introducing share options, so you can share moments from games. Consider something like Animal Crossing, a game so dedicated to this motivation of relationships that you have, so many tiers of it. So you have a mailbox for virtual characters to say, hey, I was just thinking about you. You have friends coming by, ways to share your creative output to everybody, to be part of a greater community. So you can ask yourself, is there some way that I can promote relationships in my game? Whether it's real life, being a part of a community, or anything else. Now, it's all exciting to talk about the positives of meaningful choice, but it's easy to get meaningful choice wrong. It's easy to get motivation wrong. And that's because when we see competency, when we see autonomy, we think, yeah, people like to be free, people like to be competent, but that's just, we present them with a skill and they did it. We did good. But what if they don't know what they're being asked to do? If they don't know what they're being asked to do, then they can't showcase how competent they are. What if they don't know why they failed? They didn't receive enough feedback to the choice that they made, and they don't know where they're failing at this point. Maybe you're completely lost. You've been failing and failing and failing, and at this point you don't know how you could possibly get better. That's a really bad feeling, that you're just stuck in this rut of not being able to improve your skills, and you're done. You may actually be at this point because you're so competent in the game that there's no skills left to learn. So even at extreme competency, you start to feel bad because part of competency is being able to improve your skills. And maybe the difficulty just ramps up too quickly. It was too hard, too soon, and there wasn't enough time to digest everything. And all of these are interconnected, but still, there are different lenses for us to examine our choices with for why something might be going awry. Now, we can also fail autonomy because they don't know what options are available. When we talked about hidden choices or intrinsic versus extrinsic choice, if you actually watch that video, it goes into detail about how one of the challenges of hiding the options from the player, letting them choose without really knowing that they're making a choice, is that if you don't present the choices clear enough, even though you're trying to hide them, if you haven't presented them clear enough, most people might not even bother because they didn't know the choices were there. And even if you did have lots of cool simulation happening to react to whatever they did, they may not feel like they were able to make any choices because they didn't know they were there. If there's too many choices, then they don't feel free, they feel overwhelmed. So we need to be very careful by presenting too many options or by presenting so many choices that they become exhausted and they just feel like they're being forced to make a ton of choices. So too many choices or too many options, and suddenly they don't feel free, they feel demanded upon. Now, if we know that a choice isn't going to affect anything, then we don't feel very free. If we just see, hey, will you come help me? Yes, yes, sure, yes, sarcastically, but confirmingly, that's not going to do anything for us. We know it doesn't affect anything. So why would we bother? And maybe one of the worst feelings is, oh, I really want to do B, but I know A is what's going to work for me in the game, so I guess I'll choose A. I have been a Dungeons and Dragons illusory wizard. I liked using illusion magic. It was awesome. You can trick people, you can do all kinds of fancy things to get through battles in interesting ways. But at the end of the day, I had a wand that was just so powerful and did this big blast attack that, well, might as well just always use that. And my game kind of felt ruined because I had this item that's just made every decision too easy for me. If I tried something else, it probably wouldn't help us through the encounter, so I'd have to fall back on this to help out my team. And presenting choices that are dominant, that just makes you not feel free to make the decisions you want to make anymore. So we have started to look at the different feelings that we get as designers or in gameplay experiences, but now we need to put it together as a designer. We need to think about it from the perspective of those are the experiences we want to achieve. Flow, fiero, meaningful choices. We want to motivate the player through our intrinsic motivation practices. But how do we actually make use of this? What are the tools that we can do to examine how we're doing that? Well, that's where we look at the MDA framework. This is where mechanics become experiences. This is one lens that we can structure our game through. This is one way that we can see our game to see how the things that we do directly influence player experience. And actually, there's a paper that I'll be adding to the extra resources. It's very, very short, and I highly recommend everyone read it. It's a pretty simple read, actually. So what is MDA? Well, it provides us with a lens, or we could call it 3 different lenses, to examine your game through, just like the tetrad, just like our structural elements, except this one is focusing on the roles of the people involved and where different roles are looking at the game from. This is letting us see how the experience is developing and to examine what the designer is doing, what the player is doing, and the world in between. So through the lens of MDA, we're seeing our game as rules on one end. The things that are in the game, the literal rules and procedures that need to be followed. On the other end of it, we actually have this sense of fun. Like at the end of the day, we have the player experience over there. And in between, we have a bunch of systems, the interconnectedness of everything. So designers and developers create the rules of the game. Once we mix in some players and we throw in a dash of time, then those rules create systems. And those interactions create systems. From those systems, the player experiences that, and then they get some kind of fun. They get some kind of emotion evoked from actually engaging in those systems. And this is where we get the concept of mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. So the creators are on one side, the players are on the other side, and we kind of communicate through this mutual language of dynamics or systems that we can only really predict and see where it goes. Now I have the asterisk here because we have talked about the elemental tetrad, which uses the more general term aesthetic for audiovisual aesthetics of a game, which that's the kind of outside of game design use of the term aesthetic. But in the context of the MDA framework specifically, we use the term aesthetic to refer to the types of fun that the player is experiencing, the output experience, the motivations of that specific player. So if we want to dig into these more, we can see mechanics as the specific data, the algorithms, the if statements that we put into the game. When we answer a question, when we're doing our question-answer cycles, these are the answers to those questions. So these are specific, individual components of a game. The dynamic is the behavior over time. It's how these different mechanics are interacting with one another when we put them together in the same place. It's the experience that's evoked by the rules And it's what the rules are really trying to promote or dissuade in our game. And then finally, we have the aesthetics, which are probably best summed up as the emotional response of the player to engaging in these dynamics. Why are they even playing the game in the first place? And what's motivating them to play or engage in the dynamic that's coming out of the mechanics they're experiencing? We can see this again looking at the game loop. So when I describe Binding of Isaac's core loop of run, kill, and collect, then these are three mechanics. We can run around, we can kill enemies, and we can collect stuff. Now, the loop is how these mechanics are going to work over time. They go once through the loop and they experience something. The state of the game changes a bit. The rules are interacting in unique ways, and the player is making unique choices. Now, those choices, what they look like, how the choices change over time, that's the dynamic of it. Really, the loop is the dynamic. And then the aesthetic is a step away. It's what the player is experiencing. It's not what we as the designer are putting into the game. That's what they're getting out of it, why they're playing it. And actually, since they're approaching it from the aesthetic side, they then come in with an aesthetic in mind a lot of the time. They come in with an experience that they're expecting. And that aesthetic that they're coming into your game with, what they think your game is trying to motivate them to do, can affect how they experience the mechanics. It can affect how they use your mechanics. So the dynamic of the game can change based off of the player's expected aesthetics. It's important to realize that the dynamics are not something that you as a game designer are making. You are not sitting down and designing a dynamic. You are designing a mechanic. The player is either experiencing an aesthetic or coming into a game with an aesthetic in mind. And it's from both sides of that. The handshake of that is the underlying dynamics that actually end up happening. And of course, we're going to be learning. I believe next week, we're looking at how we can have dynamics in mind and try to achieve those and how they might affect aesthetics. But the dynamics are always a handshake between the designer and the player based off of each other's expectations. Now, aesthetics are under this kind of taxonomy of fun that was proposed alongside of MDA. And more or less, it's the different reasons that we engage in games, the emotional meaning that we pull from games as we play them, or that we engage in specific dynamics and that we get from different dynamics. Now, this list, this taxonomy of fun, is purely an example. And I don't want you to start considering the taxonomy of fun. It was really never meant to be an exhaustive taxonomy. I think that's a common misnomer. In the paper itself, it has types of aesthetics that aren't even included in the paper. So clearly it was not meant as an exhaustive list. And actually, if you check out Art of Game Design, you'll see some additional aesthetics that are mentioned in there that I think are quite important. So the taxonomy of fun, as it was presented in the paper, looks like this. We have sensation, games as sense pleasure. We have fantasy, which is games as make-believe. We have narrative, or games as drama. Challenge, games as an obstacle course. Fellowship, games as social framework. Discovery, games as uncharted territory. Expression, games as self-discovery. And submission, games as pastime. We're going to look at each of these a little bit more in depth as we go. We're going to have a discussion about what each of these means. And next lecture, we're going to talk about how we can start trying to untangle these and see different players as people who like different things in this taxonomy. Now, I do want to mention that despite this list having these little quips off to the side, you might not immediately recognize the implications of each of these different aesthetics. So just going back to this, for example, we see narrative, games as drama. And you might think, yeah, if you get really into a story, if you really like the underlying story of a game, then you like the narrative. You enjoy the narrative aesthetic. If the mechanics are dialogue driven, for example, you might say, yeah, if it's dialogue mechanics, then that's probably going to lead to a narrative aesthetic. And that's totally true. But we have games like DayZ that introduce the campfire forum. I think that was a super intelligent approach to this, where DayZ itself, a game about being out in some crazy continental territory, fighting up against zombies with a server of 50 other people, where you may not even interact with them for hours at a time. Huge map, so you're not interacting with people very often. To extend the narrative aesthetic of their game, they put a forum up that was just tell stories about your experiences out in the world. And people would go on and tell highly dramatized stories about invading a pharmacy only to hear a can get knocked over, and then they hear the groans of a zombie, and they pulled out their hatchet so that they could deal with them silently, only to hear gunfire off in the distance. And then they slowed down and backed away and locked themselves in a room, hoping that they wouldn't be found, just waiting and hearing somebody come in and take out that zombie that they were so close to eliminating themselves. And then they passed. Nothing happened. They were able to get out and get back to their camp safely. And that story isn't something that happened in the game. And it's not something that the game asked you to do. None of the mechanics asked you to come up with that story. So they introduced a new mechanic, a forum off in a different place on a website unrelated to the game, kind of. And you can go on and tell your stories there. So the narrative aesthetic is actually really promoted by the drama, the distance between actions in the game. So it doesn't necessarily just mean the things that you might immediately consider when you get here. So that's aesthetics, the things that we feel when we play a game. It's the ultimate goal of the mechanics and dynamics. Now, the dynamics, they're a bit trickier to pin down, I would say. But you can start to see these dynamics using many, many different tools. Many different decompositions of your game and your actions can help you start to see what a dynamic is and how different dynamics evoke different feelings. Some quick examples, things that we will be looking at. Does the difficulty increase or does it decrease with progression? Does the game get harder or easier? Does a certain action make the game easier or harder? And to what degree? Are there different strategies that occur when we have different rules colliding? When we have this enemy who follows this script and we have this player who follows this script, and they collide, then how does that affect the gameplay? If we have two enemies who have different scripts and we put them in the same room together, does that change how the player has to approach that room, or do they treat each one individually? So what happens when these different rules collide with one another? We can also think about how the game is paced. So we talked about flow states. Well, flow state is one of those dynamics. If we can get the player into a flow state, then they're in a really nice, that is a nice dynamic to be in. So we can consider things like pacing and how our game is laid out over time, how we distribute actions and how we distribute power-ups. That's part of the dynamic of our game. Now, just like the elemental tetrad, the MDA helps us to maintain harmony with our game. The developer is thinking about the mechanics. They're thinking about these building blocks. They're thinking about your resources. They're thinking about the different actions that can be taken. And we have to understand that those lead to the dynamic nature of games. The dynamics of a game are really what are setting it apart from other media. Now, a lot of things have, I guess you could call them mechanics. We could call reading a mechanic. We could call rereading a mechanic. We could say that ending a chapter is one mechanic that books have. It's a distinction between the end of one idea and another idea. Grammar is just a set of mechanics. But the dynamic isn't anything too huge in a book. The dynamic in a movie, you get some kind of additional things that pop up in you as you juxtapose different things in a movie together. But it's nothing like a game where the player is interacting with it, and that changes the experience in a uniquely fundamental way. And the emotions that are evoked from that are also unique. Everybody is going to experience it differently, and what they're expecting to experience changes the dynamic. Now, what we want to do as designers over time, something that's just by playing games, by intentionally looking at and examining your experience while playing, and by making a lot of games and play testing a lot of games, you'll start to see patterns. You'll start to recognize that if we do this, the player is likely to experience this. If we change this, the player is likely to experience this. And this is a skill that you want to bolster. And you don't just want to think about it in games. If you can think about this clearly, if you can really examine this, then this will allow you to look at systems all over the place and see how they interconnect. You'll start to understand why something makes you feel good or why something makes you feel bad. You'll start to realize why something that should be fun shouldn't be fun because the underlying mechanics don't actually promote the dynamics that we wanted them to promote. So once you can start to see how certain dynamics are born from certain mechanics, once you can start to build up that library, then you can start to be, I don't want to say a smarter designer, but maybe a more expeditious designer. You'll be able to start getting to a good point faster by being able to predict these things. Now, in addition to this, it also lets us consider our game from two different directions, from the player perspective and from the designer perspective. We want a game that's going to promote discovery and expression, for example. If we know that we want our game to be for people who are really into discovery and expression, then we can start to consider what dynamics are we actually building up in the game? And are those dynamics leading to discovery and expression? And if they aren't, then how can we tweak our mechanics to promote those new dynamics? What dynamics would be great to have to promote those things? And can we achieve that through the mechanics that we have? Now, can we have new mechanics? Can we tweak mechanics to have new and interesting dynamics? So one example here is looking at the game Dicey Dungeons. And before we do that, it's important for us to take a look at the game Yahtzee. So Yahtzee is a older, I think, Milton Bradley game that's very, very simple to play. You just need a sheet of paper and some dice. And effectively, the sheet of paper has a whole bunch of slots, like how many fours, or like put your fours here and you get points for all of your fours. If you have 3 of a kind, then mark this off. If you have a 4 of a kind, mark this off, or how many points you get for that. So there's all these slots based off of what the dice in front of you have. So you can only fill in the 3 of a kind slot if you have 3 dice of the same. So the game is very straightforward. You roll some dice. If you would like to allocate dice, you can. Otherwise, you can re-roll some dice, and you keep you pick which ones you want to re-roll, which ones you don't want to re-roll, and you have, I think, 3 rolls before you have to stick with whatever's in front of you, and you can allocate it to these sections. And at the end of the game, whoever has the most points based off of which ones they were able to fill out before the game's end, and how well they were able to fill them out, that's what determines the winner. Pretty fun game. It's got a lot of interesting randomness, just enough choice for you to be kind of engaged. And because the dice rolls limit you to, well, you can only really look at 3 or 4 different of these cells at a time, different places you could allocate dice, you're not overwhelmed with choice at any given moment. So it kind of builds the dynamic in itself of limiting your choice space just because that dice set allocation, there's only so many things that you could actually want to go for in the first place. So you get a really nice choice space, and you're not overwhelmed with lots of choices, which is a very, very nice dynamic to have. Now, the game Dicey Dungeons is effectively following these same mechanics. You roll some dice, and over time, your dice can change, so that's a different mechanic. You can invest in having more dice on a turn if you would like. But at its core, you roll some dice, say 2 dice, and you allocate them somewhere. So each character class is going to have different actions you can allocate towards. And unlike Yahtzee, you can change the actions that you have available over time. So let's say you roll a 5 and a 6. You could choose to put it into the battle axe, but that's a maximum of 4, so you actually can't do that. You can't allocate into it. You could put the 5 or the 6 into the sword to deal direct damage, or you can put a dice into this combat roll. You can put a die into the combat roll, which will re-roll a die, and you can do that 3 times this turn. Exact same mechanics there. You roll dice, you allocate them into a slot, and then you can choose to re-roll dice to get hopefully better results. So the warrior is as close to Yahtzee as it gets. The mechanical differences here are how many dice you get, what actions are available, and the results of those actions are healing yourself or dealing damage to an opponent. So we get some more mechanics in there, like a health bar. So we have very, very similar mechanics. You could easily argue all of the same mechanics, but with different outputs and with a very different resulting dynamic and aesthetic, as you can imagine. But then it goes farther, and there's different character classes. So what happens if, rather than starting with like 3 dice and maybe getting more dice over time, what if we change that and you start with 0 dice? But you can hit the calculate button, it'll roll a die, and then a bar goes up. And you can keep rolling as many dice as you like, as long as you don't go over that bar. Now we have blackjack. So we've introduced the dynamic of blackjack, of play cards until you reach 21, and if you go over, you bust. We introduced the blackjack dynamic instead of the basic re-roll your dice dynamic. But we kept the other mechanics of these actions so that the overall core dynamic remains the same, but with a slight twist, with a little bit of extra flavor. So they changed one mechanic, how you get your dice to roll. And you get this new familiar dynamic while still maintaining the core dynamics. And they do this all the time. Change one mechanic. There's a lot of challenge modes where they change one mechanic and then it completely changes your approach to the game while still maintaining that common feel. And I think all of them really maintain the same aesthetic throughout the entire thing. So different dynamics, same aesthetics, and small mechanical changes to get those big sweeping dynamics changes. Very, very cool. Highly recommend if you can check it out, even just checking out some Let's Plays, but it's an incredibly fun game, so I do recommend it. So we're coming to the end of the lecture. I recommend a side quest now. So MDA breakdown, ID MDA. If you would like to explore the MDA a little bit more, which I do think MDA is quite fundamental, so it's worth exploring, then play a popular game and try to decompose it into MDA. I say 1 page here just because MDA, there's a lot that you can dissect. So take the time to carefully dissect it and put in the effort to consider, how do the mechanics lead to the dynamics? Have you seen those dynamics in other places? And justify it as best as you can. Now, you might not be able to do this immediately. You might want to wait until after Wednesday's lecture, but because next lecture, we're going to sit down and break down Monopoly into MDA. So if you don't know Monopoly, maybe go read the rule book or watch a Let's Play of Monopoly or something like that. Plenty of Let's Plays out there of Monopoly if you don't know the rules. So we can't use Monopoly for the quest because we're going to do it together as a class, but be prepared to start with that next time and we can take a look at it. So in summary, very big lecture today. We have flow and fiero, which are going to be pretty unique emotions to games, and it's going to help us feel competent and accomplished. We have choices, which can be explicit, implicit. They can be kind of real choices. They will have an impact on the outcome of the game, or they could be illusory. So you feel like there was an impact, but really it didn't change the state of the game in any impactful way. We have a meaningful choice as something that can actually motivate us, and it feels impactful if it's properly meaningful. We know that with Skinner boxes, rewards and penalties can refine our mental model. They can tell us what's good, what's bad, what we're supposed to be doing, what we're not supposed to be doing. But ultimately, if we want to motivate the player to want to do the actions that they're doing, I think that's one of our goals. We want the player to do the actions that they're doing. That we look to intrinsic motivation, which is where we have competency, autonomy, relationships, and sensation. That's going to make them want to take the actions. And just as a kind of small aside, for anyone who's a big Nintendo fan, if you've been playing a lot of Switch games, then I recommend you take a look at how their games have evolved over time, because you can really see a push toward intrinsic motivation. Not that Nintendo hasn't always been interested in intrinsic motivation, but more and more and more recently, you can see how they've been changing mechanics so that the game is more intrinsically motivating rather than extrinsically motivating, by focusing on the play itself, promoting all of these principles, as opposed to having to provide you with some kind of score or extrinsic reward to make you want to perform those actions. Take a look at a lot of modern franchise games like the Marios, the Paper Mario, Breath of the Wild, any of these, and see if you can spot how the game franchise has changed to promote intrinsic motivation over extrinsic motivation. I think it'll be an interesting thought process for you. And then finally, we closed on MDA, mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics, a very important lens for us to be able to look at games through. And we see dynamics as this kind of handshake between what the player is coming in expecting. If they're expecting some kind of an experience, if they're expecting some sort of emotions to come up, that's going to adjust the dynamics that they experience. And we can tweak the mechanics in certain ways to get new dynamics. And as we saw in the Dicey Dungeons example, we can actually keep all of our aesthetics perfectly intact and still achieve new dynamics. New dynamics don't always lead to new aesthetics, but they can. And it's important for us to recognize with the MDA framework that we can't directly create dynamics. We can learn to predict them. We can spot patterns in other games or in games that we've made with how certain mechanics lead to certain dynamics. But ultimately, we can't directly create a dynamic. We have to make our best guess by changing the mechanics and see where it goes. Incremental or iterative game design. And now, if we have any time left in the lecture, I think we can spend some time going over the taxonomy of fun together. So let's go over some examples of each of these if we have time. Otherwise, we'll do this one tomorrow. All right, take care, everybody.